When two people point at each other and say, "He did it," the instinct is to choose a side. That instinct is understandable. People want clarity. They want villains and protectors. They want a clean ending where one name absorbs all the blame and everyone else walks away lighter. But real exploitation cases don't work like that. They unravel slowly through contradictions, omissions, power shifts, and silence. And right now, the Whittaker story is stuck in the most dangerous phase of all, the blame loop. At the center of this loop are two men telling very different versions of the same story. Both claim they helped. Both claim they were betrayed. Both claim the other held the money. Both claim the other made the decisions. And meanwhile, the family at the center of it all is no longer together. That fact alone matters more than any live stream, accusation, or receipt. What we actually know and what we don't. Here is what can be said without guessing motives. Betty did not go to the hospital. She went to Patrick's house. Betty and Larry were not reunited with the rest of the family. They were separated from them. The house the family lived in was condemned. They cannot return to it. Those are not opinions. Those are outcomes. And outcomes don't happen in a vacuum. When help turns into control, at some point, help stops being help when the person receiving it no longer has real choices. That's the line most people miss. You don't need to intend harm to cross it. You don't need to be cruel. You just need to be in a position where your decisions override someone else's autonomy. When a family loses their home, their routines, their access to one another, and their ability to decide what happens next, someone made decisions for them. That's the core question. Not who feels more sincere on camera, not who talks better, not who sounds calmer or angrier. Who decided? The danger of picking the better person. Many people watching this situation are trying to solve it by ranking character. Who seems kinder? Who seems rougher? Who feels more genuine? But character comparison is not accountability. Two people can both be wrong in different ways. One person can exploit financially. Another can enable structurally. And neither needs to be a monster for harm to exist. The money question that won't go away. Money sits under everything here like a fault line. Not just who took money, but who controlled it. Who decided where it went? Who knew what? Who didn't? If money moved through multiple hands without the family fully understanding or consenting to the terms, that alone is a failure, regardless of who touched it last. And when receipts exist showing payments going both directions between third parties, it doesn't resolve the question. It complicates it, because complexity often hides responsibility. When a family loses voice, one of the most troubling patterns in this case is how often decisions appear to have been made around the family instead of with them. Paperwork handled by others. Plans explained after the fact. Outcomes justified instead of chosen. That's not how protection works. Protection preserves agency. Control replaces it. Why blame shifting benefits? Everyone but the family. When Eric and Patrick point at each other, something very convenient happens. The focus moves away from why the family is separated, why they have limited access to one another, why housing collapsed, why money decisions weren't transparent, why the family didn't retain control. Blame shifting turns a systemic failure into a personal feud, and feuds generate content, not solutions. What really matters in part 1, this isn't about deciding today who is worse. It's about recognizing something far more uncomfortable. If the Whittaker family is broken, displaced, and dependent, then the system of help failed. regardless of which individual feels more convincing. And that failure didn't happen overnight. It happened through small decisions, unchecked authority, and assumptions that someone else knew best. The question that starts everything. So before choosing sides, there's one question that has to be asked honestly. If all outside help disappeared tomorrow, would the Whittaker family be safer, more stable, and more empowered than they were before? If the answer is no, then exploitation didn't require a single villain. It required imbalance. And in part 2, we examine how imbalance forms, why it's often invisible at first, and how help can slowly turn into control without anyone announcing it. Comment below with one word only: control or confusion, and why you think that word fits what we're seeing. The most dangerous shifts don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with shouting or force. They arrive wrapped in assistance. Someone offers help. Someone else accepts because they have no better option. And slowly, the balance changes. Not because anyone said, "I'm in charge now," but because circumstances made resistance expensive. That's how power moves in situations like this. The moment dependence replaces choice. At the beginning, help looks simple. A ride here, a place to stay, someone to handle paperwork, someone to talk to officials. Each individual action feels reasonable, even generous, but together they create dependency. Once someone controls transportation, they control movement. Once someone controls housing, they control stability. Once someone controls information, they control perception. And once all three exist at the same time, the person receiving help no longer has leverage. Not because they're weak, because they're cornered. Why gratitude silences objection? This is where many observers get it wrong. They say, why didn't they speak up? Why didn't they refuse? Why didn't they leave? Those questions assume choice still existed, but gratitude is a powerful silencer. When someone rescues you during crisis, saying no feels dangerous. You worry you'll seem ungrateful. You worry the help will vanish. You worry things will get worse. So you comply, not because you agree, because disagreement feels unsafe. When knowing better overrides consent. Another quiet shift happens when helpers believe they understand the situation better than the people living inside it. This usually sounds like concern. They don't really understand what's happening. This is too complicated for them. I'll just handle it. At first, this feels protective, but protection without consent is still control. If decisions are made without explanation, without alternatives, without the ability to refuse, agency is gone. And agency is not optional when someone's life is being rearranged. The danger of proxy voices. One of the clearest warning signs in any exploitation case is proxy speaking. That's when someone else becomes the translator of another person's reality. They explain what the family wants. They explain what the family needs. They explain what the family understands. Eventually, the family's own voice disappears, not because they stopped speaking, but because others spoke over them. This is especially dangerous when the people affected are elderly, disabled, or overwhelmed, because once someone becomes the voice, disagreement gets framed as confusion or incapacity. When transparency becomes optional, healthy help systems are transparent by default. Money is explained. Decisions are documented. Timelines are shared. But once power concentrates, transparency often becomes selective. Information is shared when convenient, withheld when complicated, explained after the fact. Not always maliciously, but consistently. And consistency is what matters. Because without full information, consent is impossible. Why outcomes matter more than intent. This is where people get emotionally stuck. They debate intent. He meant well. She was trying to help. They didn't plan for this. But intent doesn't undo outcomes. A family without a home is an outcome. A family separated from each other is an outcome. A family unsure who controls their money is an outcome. Outcomes don't care what anyone meant. They only reflect what happened. The power shift no one wants to name. There is an uncomfortable truth in this case. At some point, decision-making moved away from the Whittaker family. That doesn't automatically make anyone a villain, but it does establish a power shift. And power shifts demand accountability, because once someone else decides where you live, who you see, what you sign, how money moves, you are no longer the authority in your own life, even if the person deciding claims to be acting for you. Why public conflict is a red flag. When helpers begin arguing publicly, something important has already broken. Healthy support doesn't need a courtroom audience. It doesn't need live streams to justify itself. It doesn't need character battles. Public conflict usually means private trust is gone, boundaries were unclear, roles were never properly defined. And when roles aren't defined, power fills the gap. The family as evidence. Here's the hardest part to sit with. If help worked the way it was supposed to, the family would be stronger today than before help arrived. More stable, more informed, more united. Instead, they are fractured. That doesn't mean every person involved acted with malice, but it does mean the system failed. And systems fail when no one is clearly responsible, but everyone has influence. Why? Who to blame? Is the wrong first question. The right question isn't, who is lying? It's, who had the power to say yes or no? And when did that change? Because exploitation doesn't require theft alone. It requires imbalance plus vulnerability. And vulnerability was present from the start. The warning sign people missed. The warning wasn't the argument. It wasn't the receipts. It wasn't the live streams. It was the moment decisions kept being made for the family instead of with them, without a clear, documented structure protecting their autonomy. That's the point where help stops being neutral. And once that line is crossed, everything afterward becomes suspect. Where this leads next. In Part 3, we stop looking at intentions entirely. We examine control points. Who controlled housing? Who controlled money? Who controlled access? Who controlled information? Because exploitation doesn't hide in emotions. It hides in logistics. And logistics leave trails. Comment below, what do you think mattered more here? Dependence or decision-making? One word, and why? If you want to understand what actually happened here, you have to stop watching the arguments and start watching the mechanics. Conflict is loud. Control is quiet. People fight when power has already shifted. They argue when trust is already broken. They go public when private systems have failed. So Part 3 isn't about who said what online. It's about who controlled what and when. Because exploitation doesn't begin with cruelty. It begins with access. The 4 control points that decide everything. Every exploitation case, no matter how emotional or chaotic, reduces to 4 practical control points. Housing, money, access to people, access to information. If one person holds all 4, intent becomes irrelevant. Let's walk through them carefully. 1. Housing. Where you sleep is where power starts. Housing is the first and most decisive lever. When someone controls where you sleep, they control your sense of safety, your daily routine, your ability to say no, because disagreement risks displacement. In this situation, the Whittaker family lost their home environment. Whether through condemnation, intervention, or emergency relocation, the result was the same. They no longer controlled where they lived. Once that happens, whoever provides housing becomes the default authority, even if no one asked for that authority, even if no one wanted it, because survival needs don't wait for perfect arrangements. And here's the key point. When housing is temporary and conditional, silence becomes strategy. You don't argue with the roof over your head. You don't challenge the person holding the keys, not because you agree, because instability is terrifying. 2. Money. Who touches it? Who decides it? Who explains it? Money is the second lever, and it's more dangerous than housing because it's invisible. The public conversation keeps getting stuck on amounts. That's a distraction. The real question is control, not totals. Who received the funds? Decided how they were split? Determined timing? Explained delays? Answered questions? Because if you don't control the money, you don't control your future. And here's the uncomfortable reality. When vulnerable people don't fully understand digital monetization, platforms, splits, taxes, or contracts, the person managing those systems holds enormous power, even if they never asked for it. That power demands oversight. Without oversight, exploitation doesn't require stealing. It only requires deciding. 3. Access. Who gets to see whom and when? This is the most emotionally charged control point. Access isn't just physical presence. It's connection. Who gets to visit? Who gets to speak privately? Who relays messages? Who decides when now isn't a good time? Once access is filtered through a third party, relationships change. Not necessarily because someone intends to isolate, but because mediation replaces direct contact, and mediation always alters truth. When family members can't freely see or speak to each other, confusion fills the gaps. Rumors start, fear grows, dependence deepens, and the person controlling access becomes the gatekeeper of reality. That's an enormous responsibility, and a dangerous one if undocumented. 4. Information. The most invisible control of all. Information is the last lever, and it's the one people miss. Who talks to lawyers, officials, agencies, the public? Who explains what happened? Who summarizes decisions? Who says this is normal or this is required? Information control doesn't require lying. It only requires framing, and framing shapes perception. If someone hears, "This is for your own good. You don't need to worry about that. I'll handle it," often enough, they stop asking questions. Not because they don't care, because caring feels exhausting. When all four align, here's the point most people don't want to face. When one individual or small group controls housing, money access, and information at the same time, that is power concentration. Not influence, not assistance. Power. And power without structure is where harm happens, even unintentionally. Why the public fights are a symptom, not the cause. People keep asking, who lied? Who's worse? Who deserves blame? Those questions come too late. By the time accusations start flying, the damage is already done. Public fights don't create exploitation. They reveal it. Because once control is challenged, it has to defend itself. And defense often looks like character attacks, narrative wars, selective disclosures, emotional appeals. None of that answers the real question. Who had authority, and was it ever clearly defined? The role confusion problem. One of the most dangerous aspects of this case is role confusion. Was someone a helper, a manager, a caregiver, a content creator, a financial intermediary, a spokesperson, or all of them at once? Because roles that overlap create conflicts of interest. A person cannot ethically be both beneficiary and protector, both narrator and decision-maker, both fundraiser and distributor, without strict safeguards. Good intentions don't eliminate conflicts. They only make them harder to question. Why they agreed is not a safe answer. Some defenders say they agreed to it. Agreement is not consent if alternatives weren't explained, consequences weren't understood, pressure existed, information was incomplete. Consent requires capacity, clarity, and choice. Remove any one of those, and agreement becomes compliance. And compliance is not protection. The most important question no one answered. At no point has this been clearly answered. Who was responsible for protecting the Whittaker family's autonomy when help became power, not helping them, protecting their agency? Who ensured they could say no, they could change their minds, they could access independent advice, they could see their family freely, they could understand money decisions? If the answer is no one, then the system failed, regardless of individual intent. Why documentation is the dividing line? Here's the line that separates ethical help from dangerous help. Documentation. Healthy systems document consent, roles, boundaries, finances, decision authority. When documentation is missing, power fills the vacuum. And when power fills a vacuum around vulnerable people, harm becomes likely. This isn't about good versus bad people. That framing is emotionally satisfying and legally useless. The real issue is unstructured authority. People can care deeply and still cause harm. People can mean well and still exploit. People can help and still overstep. Systems protect people. Intent does not. Where this leads, what documents should have existed? What protections should have been triggered? What oversight should have been automatic once money and relocation entered the picture? Because exploitation isn't proven by outrage. It's proven by absence. And absence leaves fingerprints. Comment below which control point mattered most here. Housing, money, access, or information. One word. Because power without documentation isn't just risky, it's indefensible. This is the moment where emotional arguments stop working. This is where systems either exist or they don't. And when vulnerable people are involved, absence of paperwork is not neutral. It's a warning sign. Why paper matters more than promises. Every serious support situation, especially one involving money, housing, and disabled adults, triggers an automatic question in any functional system. Where is the documentation? Not because people are untrustworthy by default, because memory changes, stories drift, pressure distorts intent. Paper doesn't forget. When something goes wrong, paper is how you separate confusion from manipulation, chaos from control, mistakes from misconduct. So let's talk about what should exist in a situation like this, regardless of who you believe. Document Category 1. Authority and Role Definition. The very first document that should exist is also the simplest. Who is allowed to do what? At minimum, there should be clarity on who is a helper, who is a caregiver, who manages money, who speaks publicly, who makes decisions. This doesn't require a lawyer to draft a novel. It can be a written agreement, a signed acknowledgement, a role clarification memo, a temporary care authorization. Without this, roles blur, and when roles blur, accountability disappears, because later, everyone can truthfully say, "I thought I was allowed. I assumed that was my responsibility. They never told me otherwise." Paper prevents that. Document Category 2. Consent, real, informed, traceable. Consent is not a vibe. Consent is not silence. Consent is not gratitude. Consent must be informed, voluntary, documented, revisitable, especially when dealing with people who may have limited capacity to understand complex arrangements. In this case, consent should have addressed filming, monetization, distribution of funds, relocation, representation, and not once, repeatedly, because consent can be withdrawn if there is no record showing what was explained, when it was explained, how it was understood. Then consent becomes impossible to prove, and that doesn't automatically mean exploitation occurred, but it does mean protection failed. Document Category 3. Financial transparency. This is where most cases collapse. Money doesn't require evil intent to cause harm. It only requires imbalance. In any situation where money is raised for someone else, the following should exist: a ledger, receipts, platform statements, payout records, expense explanations, not privately, not trust me, not I'll show you later. Continuously. If funds were split, the split should be documented. If funds were delayed, reasons should be recorded. If funds were held, justification should be written. Because without this, even honest people look deceptive. And when vulnerable people are involved, looking deceptive becomes legally dangerous. Document Category 4. Housing and relocation records. If people are moved, even temporarily, documentation is essential. This includes where they're staying, why the move happened, how long it's expected to last, who approved it, what alternatives were offered. Without this, displacement becomes indistinguishable from removal. And removal, even if well-intended, can traumatize people who rely on familiarity for stability. Paper isn't bureaucracy here. It's reassurance. It tells people, this isn't permanent. You're not being erased. You're not losing your place. Document Category 5. Oversight and third-party involvement. The most important safeguard of all is someone who isn't emotionally invested. Oversight isn't an insult. It's protection. At some point, someone should have been able to say, I'm not involved, but I'm reviewing this. Here's what the documents show. Here's what needs to change. Oversight prevents dependency, hero narratives, unchecked authority. When there is no neutral party, power concentrates naturally, not because people want it to, because no one stops it. The dangerous myth of everyone was trying to help. This phrase keeps appearing, and it's sincere, but it's also irrelevant. Intent does not replace infrastructure. If help is not structured, it becomes improvisation. If improvisation becomes prolonged, it becomes control. If control lacks oversight, it becomes exploitation. That progression doesn't require malice. It requires absence of guardrails. Why the timing matters. Some people ask, why question this now? Because the damage appears after the system collapses, not while it's running. While things are moving, people tolerate confusion. Once things stop, the questions begin. And the first question is always, where's the paperwork? If the answer is scattered, informal, verbal, missing, then responsibility doesn't disappear. It multiplies. The silence problem. Another red flag isn't just missing documents. It's delayed explanations. When questions about money, access, or authority are met with defensiveness, silence, emotional appeals, blame shifting, instead of clarity, something is wrong. Transparency calms situations. Secrecy escalates them. Every time. Why? We didn't know better doesn't hold. Ignorance doesn't excuse systems failure when vulnerable people are involved. That's not cruelty. That's law. If you choose to raise money publicly, manage housing, coordinate care, speak for others, you accept the responsibility to do it correctly. Not perfectly, correctly. And we didn't know becomes irrelevant once harm appears. What the absence tells us. Let's be very precise here. Missing paperwork does not automatically prove criminal exploitation, but it does prove that safeguards were insufficient, boundaries were unclear, oversight was missing, vulnerable people were exposed. That alone is enough to justify investigation, because the job of the system isn't to punish bad people. It's to prevent harm. Why this is hard for the public to accept. People want villains. People want heroes. People want endings. Paperwork offers none of that. It offers responsibility, process, accountability, and that feels cold. But cold systems protect people better than warm chaos. The uncomfortable bottom line. If the Whittaker family had clear consent records, transparent financial documentation, defined roles, independent oversight, this case would never have reached this point. The absence of those things didn't create guilt, but it created vulnerability. And vulnerability is what exploitation feeds on. Where this leads next, because it's not about blame, it's about repair. What would responsible intervention look like now? What boundaries must exist going forward? And what should never be allowed to happen again, no matter who is involved? That's where this ends. Comment below which document mattered most: consent, finances, housing, or oversight. One word. This is the part people usually skip, because repair isn't dramatic. It doesn't crown a winner. It doesn't validate outrage. Repair is slow, procedural, and uncomfortable, and that's exactly why it matters. If Part 4 explained what should have existed, Part 5 answers the only question that matters now. What does responsible intervention look like after the damage is already done? Not in theory, not emotionally. In reality, repair starts with stopping the bleeding. Before anything else, one principle comes first. No new action without structure. No new help. No new fundraising. No new representation. No new, I'll fix it. Because unstructured help is how this situation got worse. Repair begins by freezing chaos. That means no informal money handling, no private decision-making, no solo gatekeepers, no exclusive access. Until rules are clear, nothing moves. Step 1. Remove personality from power. The single biggest failure here was personality-driven authority. People trusted individuals instead of systems. They followed confidence instead of documentation. They accepted familiarity instead of verification. That cannot happen again. Repair requires one non-negotiable change. No single person can be the conduit to the family. Not a content creator. Not a helper. Not a good guy. Not someone with history. Access must be shared, monitored, and conditional. This protects the family and the helpers. Step 2. Establish a single verified authority channel. Chaos thrives when everyone thinks they have standing. Repair demands clarity. There must be one verified point of authorization, clearly defined legal standing, documented scope of authority. This doesn't mean control. It means limits. Who can approve care? Who can approve funds? Who can approve housing? Who can approve public statements? If the answer isn't written down, it doesn't exist. Step 3. Third-party oversight is not optional. This is where people get defensive. They hear oversight and think accusation. That's ego talking. Oversight is what separates help from harm. A neutral third party must review finances, review care arrangements, review access rules, review complaints, not occasionally, continuously. Oversight prevents hero narratives, savior complexes, power consolidation. It also protects good actors from suspicion. If you're doing nothing wrong, oversight is your shield, not your enemy. Step 4. Rebuild consent, slowly and repeatedly. Consent that was never properly documented must be rebuilt. That means explaining, not assuming, revisiting, not finalizing, checking comprehension, not compliance, especially with people who may struggle to articulate discomfort. Consent should be documented, revisited regularly, revocable, and silence must never be treated as agreement. If someone doesn't object, that doesn't mean they understand. If someone cooperates, that doesn't mean they're comfortable. Repair respects that. Step 5. Money must become boring. This is critical. Money must stop being emotional. It must stop being personal. It must stop being heroic. Repair requires verified accounts, transparent reporting, regular audits, clear separation of funds. No holding money for later. No, trust me. No, we'll sort it out. Every dollar must be traceable. Because money doesn't just buy things, it buys leverage. And leverage over vulnerable people is the fastest route back to exploitation. Step 6. Repair the damage that isn't visible. This is the part the system often misses. Disruption harms people even when intentions are good. Repair must include restoring continuity where possible, acknowledging loss, validating confusion, rebuilding routines. Not everything broken can be fixed, but pretending nothing broke guarantees further harm. For people whose world depends on familiarity, disruption isn't temporary, it's destabilizing. Repair respects that reality. Step 7. No content-first behavior. Ever again. This must be explicit. No filming before consent. No updates before stability. No monetization tied to crisis. If help is real, it can survive silence. If attention is required to justify involvement, involvement isn't about care. This is where lines must be drawn permanently. What repair is not. Repair is not defending past actions, rewriting intent, assigning all blame to one person, rushing to move on. Repair does not require villains. It requires accountability. And accountability does not mean punishment. It means responsibility. The most important rule going forward. Here it is, stripped of emotion. No one should ever have unchecked access to vulnerable people again. Not because people are bad, because people are human. Power plus access, plus money, plus attention, without oversight, will always produce harm. Always. Why this matters beyond this case. This isn't just about one family. This is a case study in what happens when internet attention replaces structure, compassion outruns safeguards, and systems arrive after damage instead of before. If this ends without change, it will happen again, to someone else. Different names, same pattern, the quiet truth. Everyone involved may genuinely believe they were helping. That doesn't change the outcome. Protection isn't about belief. It's about systems that hold up under pressure. And pressure always comes. Where this leaves US, there may still be investigations. There may still be court outcomes. There may still be revelations. But none of that replaces this responsibility. Learn from what failed. Not to punish, to prevent. Because the people at the center of the story don't get to reset the damage by logging off. They live with it. One word only. Oversight, consent, money, access. Which one failed most? And why? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.